Hey, welcome to a special edition of Parallax Views, an IEA-sponsored series of conversations about the politics of culture. My name is Marc Glendening, and today we're very fortunate to have with us the philosopher Gary Lachman, who will be talking about his paper, Trickle-down Metaphysics from Nietzsche to Trump. I don't want to sound too precious or pretentious, but when I first came across this paper, I had a moment a bit like Jean-Paul Sartre is said to have had when he was introduced to the idea of phenomenology by a fellow student who had been over to Germany to hear Martin Heidegger talking about phenomenology, and the student tried to explain to Sartre the basics of the theory using an apricot cocktail that was in between them in this bar in Saint-Germain. Apparently he fainted. I held it together a little bit better than Jean-Paul, but I was very, very excited by this paper. And today's talk that Gary's going to give us is really a follow-up to a Parallax Views conversation we had, which has come out recently on YouTube, about his book, Caretakers of the Cosmos, which is about human consciousness, free will, and the search for personal meaning. And this paper puts into philosophical context, I think, many of the weird developments we have been experiencing in recent years with the sort of revival in QAnon style conspiracy theories, the way in which postmodernism seems to have sort of captured even the mainstream left now. You can't really understand, I think, sort of phenomena like Prince Harry and Meghan or transgender ideology unless you really get the sort of background, historical background to it all in Gary's paper. As Gary puts it, once reality is up for grabs, there's no telling who will end up grabbing it. Words to that effect. Yes. So on that note, I will hand over to Gary Lachman.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Marc. Yes, I'm going to be talking, as Marc said, about this idea of trickle-down metaphysics, or this phrase. And I mention it, or I say that, sort of a throwaway, in this book, Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump, that came out, I think it was 2018. And we'll get on to sort of the raison d'etre for doing that book. But then you look towards the end of the talk here. But what I'm basically saying here is, although I'd be surprised if Trump knew of Nietzsche, he probably heard the name somewhere, probably pronounces it Nietzsche or something like that, if at all. And I don't think he, again, he probably heard of postmodernism, this sort of stuff, in some peripheral kind of way. But I don't think, in any way he's a devotee or anyone who's au fait with any of these sorts of things. But it struck me that I think there's an argument to say that in some ways Trump is the fulfillment, or at least part of the fulfillment, or a result of the fulfillment of a prophecy that Nietzsche made in the mid-1880s. And this has to do with a book. Well, not a book, a collection of notes left after his, here we go, I don't need the thing, after his mental collapse, his mental and spiritual death, happened in 1889. He lingered on as sort of a vegetable, more or less, until 1900. And I call it untimely Nietzsche's will to power, in the sense that Nietzsche always considered himself an untimely individual. One of his early books is called Untimely Meditations, or another translation is Thoughts Out of Season. So he was not necessarily with it, what was happening. He was usually ahead of it, whatever it was. And in another context, one of his later books, I believe it's The Antichrist, he says, I write not for today nor for tomorrow, I write for the day after tomorrow. So he was, he was so far ahead that he certainly didn't believe any contemporaries understood him, not even the next generation. Although in the last months of his conscious life, he started to get some recognition. There was a Danish scholar, Georges Brandes, who started a series of lectures on Nietzsche's work. Up until then, he hardly had any readers at all. He had to pay pretty much for the publication of his own work, and I think maybe he sold a few hundred books, throughout his lifetime. I mean, now, if you go to a university, you throw a rock in any direction, you'll hit one of his books probably, or something like that, or a book about one of his books, or a book about a book about a book about one of his books. So he's one of these great tragic characters who never understood, the celebrity, the success that he later had. And in another one of his later books, his autobiography, Ecce Homo, which is one of the strangest autobiographies ever written, if you ever get a chance, it's a very thin volume, and it's a tragic, painful, heartbreaking read because he's going off the deep end. He's just on the brink of collapsing, most likely from the effects of syphilis, but that's still kind of an open question what actually led to his madness. But one of the reasons he's written this book, and Ecce Homo means behold the man, and that shows his megalomaniacal association with Christ, was that above all, do not confuse me with who I am not. And sadly, this is exactly what happened to Nietzsche. Because after he went mad, all of his work fell into the hands of his odious sister, Elisabeth Fürste Nietzsche, who had spent some time in South America with her husband Bernard Fürste, trying to set up a pro-Aryan, you might say proto-Nazi, anachronistically, community there. Bernard didn't turn out to be quite a man of integrity. He embezzled most of the funds for this community, and when it all came out, he committed suicide. So his sister came back just in time to help her poor brother, Friedrich, who had collapsed in Turin in January 1889. She got in control of all of Nietzsche's work, and she set up a Nietzsche archive. One of the people that she asked to help do this was the, at the time, Austrian man of all intellectual trades, Rudolf Steiner, who later went on to develop his own system, anthroposophy. And he tells the story of meeting Nietzsche at this time, insofar as you can meet someone who was in tertiary stage of syphilis or whatever. He was just dribbling at the mouth. But his sister used to dress him up in a toga and put him in a chair next to the window looking out on the landscape and bring in prestigious individuals and introduce them to her brother, the philosopher, and he's meditating. He was out of his mind. But she was also pro-Aryan. She later became a Nazi supporter. And she ingratiated herself with Hitler and National Socialism. She edited Nietzsche's work so that all of his remarks about having anti-Semites shot and the great race swindle and all the many anti-German, anti-military, decidedly not pro-Nazi phrases got edited out, and this is Nietzsche was mistaken for whom he was not, and became sort of Nazi. He was considered a Nazi philosopher. This is why his later reputation in English after the war was tarnished for a long time, until these two gentlemen, Walter Kaufmann and R.J. Hollingdale, and they did very, very good translations and reintroduced Nietzsche. But she put together all these notes that Nietzsche left after his Nachlass, all the stuff that's left over. And she presented it as his great work, his systematic work of philosophy, which it wasn't. And there are still scholars today who consider that that's what it is, but it wasn't. It's a fantastic book. It's like all of Nietzsche's writing. Anything Nietzsche wrote, the laundry list would be fascinating. But it's not a book. But in it, this is where he makes the prediction, where he predicts the advent of something that is unavoidable, inescapable, and it's on its way. And what is it? It's the advent of nihilism. The advent of nihilism. What's nihilism, you ask? Well, the term, which means belief in nothing, which could be construed to mean an active belief in nothing, or non-belief. You have no beliefs, anything. But it was coined by the Russian writer Turgenev in his novel Fathers and Sons. And it actually had a historical, cultural context. It came out of the generation conflict between the Romantic generation of Russian thinkers and what was called the New Men, the generation that came after them, who were positivists, scientific positivists. That doesn't mean they were upbeat and optimistic. It meant that the only thing that we could speak of with any clarity and knowledge was that which could be positively identified by science, by the senses, or by the tools we use to enhance our senses. And this later on became a whole philosophical school, especially here in England, logical positivism. A.J. Ayer, people like that. Wittgenstein was associated with it. But at the time, it was the new men completely rejected the previous generation's romantic, spiritual ideas about changing society. Mostly, the problem of the serfs. What do we do with the serfs? This was the main question in Russian history for the longest time. What are we going to do with the serfs? And the previous generation, they had this notion of what they called the beautiful soul, which they got from German idealism and people like Goethe and Schiller. And the idea was that if you developed yourself so that you embodied these high ideals, you could teach by example. So rather than political activism, you taught by example, a kind of quietivism or something like that. Well, the new men got really tired of that. That didn't work. Nothing had happened. And they said, no, we got to do this scientifically. It has to be strict, scientific. And we reject all of this previous high idealism. We reject previous ideas. And everything just has to be done, according to science and all of that. And someone who picked up on this idea and wrote a remarkably powerful novel about it was Dostoevsky. And in his novel, The Devils, it's also translated as The Demons and The Possessed. It's a story of what happens when the new men come to town, as it were. And it's a hair-raising thriller. I mean, Dostoevsky was a thriller writer. He was existential, deeply spiritual, but he wrote crime novels. So there's a couple suicides, half a dozen murders, the town's in flame, and this is all in the name of progress. This is all in the name of the new scientific progressive ideas that were going to, rectify the problems in Russian society. And I have a photo here of the American historian Jacques Barzin, who died maybe 10 years ago, but you might not know of him, but he lived, I think he was 107 when he died. I think he died like 2010 or something like that. And he's there because he has a wonderful quote about the difference between nihilists and anarchists, and they're usually confused. But he says, a true nihilist believes in nothing and does nothing about it, right? The anarchist believes in nothing and wants to tear everything down, so he's a much more active cousin. But the true nihilist doesn't do anything, so it's this complete apolitical, agnostic. He has no beliefs and basically is just driven by creature comforts and things of that sort. But Nietzsche picked up on this idea and took it out of its context in Russian history and applied it to Western civilization in toto. And what he said is that, here's some definitions of nihilism there, is that the very high ideals that have informed and motivated Western civilization from the Greeks and then through Christianity, they themselves have uncovered the uncomfortable truth that there is no truth, the capital T. The scientific, philosophical pursuit of truth, out of which the scientific pursuit of truth, rational inquiry, came out of. By the 19th century, and you have to remember, Nietzsche was a child of the 19th century, so he accepted the findings of 19th century science. He was a materialist in that way. He, like the nihilists, he rejected any belief in any kind of higher spiritual, Platonic, ideal world, anything like that. So the Platonic search for truth has arrived at the notion that there is no truth. The quest for reality, with the capital R, the essential fundamental reality, according to Nietzsche, I'm not necessarily endorsing his views, don't shoot the messenger, has led to the recognition that there is no such truth. And the more spiritually motivated, ethically motivated necessity to pursue the truth, driven home to us in Christian teaching, has come to the same conclusion as well. So for Nietzsche, nihilism is what he says, that the highest truths that have, the highest ideals have in the end undermined themselves. And that's no one else knows. I'm the visionary. I don't mean this in a satirical kind of way. He's the lonely. That's why I call it trickle down. Nietzsche's on the lonely mountaintop, right? He's untimely. He's not writing for today or tomorrow. It's the day after tomorrow, way over there, and he's predicting the future of the next 200 years of European civilization. And what I'm saying is like, well, the ETA is a bit sped up of that. And I'll get to the punchline. I think Nietzsche's prediction of what was going to happen in Europe 200 years hence kind of came home to roost a few years ago when Trump got elected. But, okay, maybe there's no Platonic high ideal. Maybe there's no loving God, who cares about us and has somehow organized our life in such a way that, we have an opportunity to go to heaven later on and all that. But what about science? Science certainly, gives us some truth. Science is about facts. This is what the new men were about, the positivism of science. But Nietzsche would say, well, actually, no, there's no such thing as facts, which we will hear later on. There's only interpretations. Nietzsche will say that the pursuit of science and the truths that science provides are the kind of error that a certain species of life could not live without. So our truths are a certain kind of error. We falsify the world. It works. We're able to manipulate the world. We're able to make things happen. We're getting recorded. We can go to the moon and all that sort of thing. But because things work, because they're utilitarianly effective, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the world is really like. And a later contemporary of Nietzsche, the French philosopher Bergson, made a similar argument. And he said that the brain, the intellect, is the organ for attention to life. So the intellect, the brain, reason, all of that science is about how to best navigate through life. The essence of things, it cannot reveal to us. The intellect cannot reveal the essence of things to it. That can come through intuition. Bergson was more of a metaphysician than Nietzsche. Nietzsche didn't think about intuition or anything like that. And Bergson actually, fundamentally had a sort of Christian point of view, or at least a religious one. His last book is the Two Sources of Morality and Religion, and he said the universe is a machine for making gods. So he had a more optimistic vision than Nietzsche had, but he agreed with Nietzsche that the facts that science provide are not true semblances of how things really are. They're a manipulation of reality that's effective. It helps us get through life. It's made us, the most dominant species, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's giving us a true picture. So here we have, the evolution up there, and Bergson. Okay, so Nietzsche's still up in the mountaintop. Nobody knows anything about him. In his most famous work, Zarathustra goes to the marketplace to tell people the great message of the death of God, but they don't want to hear it. They don't want to know it. Even though they're the ones responsible for the theocide, they don't know what they've done. Father, forgive them. They know not what they've done. They themselves have killed God, but the fallout from that has not reached them yet, so they don't know. He says that these ears they're not yet ears for my message. All right, so, but I don't know, 20 years after Nietzsche dies, someone picks up on it. I mean, there's a lot of, after Nietzsche dies, there's an incredible Nietzsche mania. I mean, there's, everybody's, Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, everyone is reading Nietzsche and talking about Nietzsche and all that. But the peculiar notion of this nihilism, this advent of nihilism, becomes a central theme with the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger is the old school Herr Doctor professor. You know, he's an academic's academic and all that. Nietzsche's the fugitive, you know, wanderer on the outskirts of things. He had to give up his academic position as a philologist because of ill health. He was sick all the time. For someone who had a rotten life, he sang the praises of life. He was a yay-sayer. He affirmed life all the time. He had an absolutely rotten life. His early mentor and later kind of sparring partner. Nietzsche had always needed a good enemy. So there was Socrates was one, Plato was one, another was Schopenhauer, Wagner was another one. Schopenhauer, who had an absolutely pessimistic view of, you know, life is suffering and that's it. He had a Buddhist kind of view of it. He had a wonderful life. He was very happy. You know, he had enough money. He could eat, drink, and have mistresses and all that. Nietzsche was absolutely miserable and he's saying yes to life. So I don't know, figure it out, folks. But Heidegger says what's happened, but this advent of nihilism, is that Western philosophy has lost touch with the Seinfrage, the question of being. Not the question of beings, that's a being, you're all beings here, but the fact that you are here means you are being in a verb, you are. And this seems the most obvious thing. Doesn't seem to be much we could say about that, you know. And this was one reason why, after the pre-Socratic philosophers with the Plato and then Aristotle, the question of being seems to get mislaid. It's misplaced. It's no longer a central theme in Western philosophy. Or it's rationalized. It's turned into metaphysics. It's turned into Platonic ideas or something like that. But Heidegger believes, no, we just lost touch with this primal question about what does it mean to be, or as the later the 13th century German theologian Meister Eckhart would call it Istigkeit, isness. The pure isness of things. And he said we took a wrong turn at Plato. So we have to go back and go back to the pre-Socratic philosophers, Parmenides, Empedocles, Heraclitus, there you go. That was a Heideggerian slip. Because they're still in touch. They were half poets and half philosophers. They hadn't started rationalizing everything. They hadn't started turning everything into a product of the intellect, and they were still in touch with the mythic sources of which, that's a way in which we can participate in being. So I had to go back before Plato. But interesting thing that, and the reason I have these two gentlemen up here, is that Heidegger said one of the surefire methods for us to recontact with being is to have a very vivid sense of our own death. That's why his form of existentialism is very dreary. It's very depressing. You have to, your finitude, your finality. We are radically finite beings. And Nietzsche would say, you know, Christianity is a way, we've invented a way to avoid the notion of our finitude. Heidegger would say, yes, the notion of some Platonic ideal realm, that's just the true world and not the fleeting world that we exist in now. That's another kind of way to avoid the actual fact that, you know, we will all die. This will stop. We're the only being that's aware of our being. So far, we haven't met anybody else. The table isn't aware of its being. The chair is not. The clouds aren't. We can ask the question of being, but that comes at the price of knowing that at some point we won't be. And this is something that we avoid. But so avoiding the question of death leads to avoidance of the sense of being. But if we confront death, if we, you know, radically, vividly confront the reality of our death, we'll awaken to being. And this was something, an insight he shared with the enigmatic Armenian esoteric teacher G.I. Gurdjieff, who was a contemporary of Heidegger's. And like Heidegger, he wrote an enormous book that's almost unreadable. I mean, if you're being in time, if you've ever taken a look at it, and Heidegger, it's this endless, German is pretty bad, you know, but he's worse than Hegel, you know, it's like this endless sentences, dependent clauses, neologisms, things of that sort. And Gurdjieff, in this book called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, did much the same thing. It's a radically different book, but it's written in this incredibly complex, difficult way. It's made up of one parenthetical clause and dependent clause and neologism after the other. But they both agreed that only thing that would wake us up to our forgetfulness of being, Seinvergessenheit, is the confrontation with death. So they would agree with Dr. Johnson, who said, the thought that a man will be hanged in a week concentrates the mind wonderfully. So he hadn't read Heidegger or Gurdjieff, but he came to the same insight that if you confront if you know you're going to be hanged in a week, suddenly all the triviality of life disappears. So there's two branches that come out of Heidegger. Mentioned Sartre. One is existentialism, bad faith, mauvaise foi, and Galois, or Gitans. I don't know which ones they smoked. And we have Jean-Paul and Simone, and there's Albert Camus over here. He tries to one-up Heidegger with being in nothingness, rather than being in time. But they take on the notion of the meaninglessness and finitude of life, but what that leads to is what they say, being condemned to be free. We are free, inescapably free. We can't avoid being free, but we do everything we can to avoid the freedom. We want to fill up the freedom. Human freedom is as a whole in being. The existential famous distinction is everything, essence precedes existence. So before this table was made, its reason to come into being was there. Somebody needed a table, so we made a table. What's our reason for existing? So human beings, our existence precedes our essence. There is no reason for us in the same way that there's a reason for the table or a chair or anything like that. Or he would say, put that out into nature, there's no reason for anything in nature. It's radically contingent. It's all arbitrary. Absolutely no reason. There's no reason why anything exists in the first place. We have to face that. And if you don't face that, you're in bad faith. You're inauthentic. This was Sartre's philosophy was the famous one. This is the existentialists on the left bank, and they all smoked Gitans, stayed up all night, drank a lot, wore black turtlenecks and berets and things of that sort. Listened to jazz music, and this got eclipsed in. Okay, I'll just quick in the next one. Both Sartre and Heidegger come out of the, just a little backtrack here, the philosophy. Marc mentioned phenomenology. That's the gentleman over there, looks a bit like Groucho Marx, with the glasses and mustache. That's Edmund Husserl, who's a German philosopher who was the founder of phenomenology. And that's a mouthful, phenomenology, but basically it's the study of phenomena as they appear in the way that they appear. So a phenomena is anything that you're conscious of. And the fundamental insight of phenomenology is that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Consciousness is intentional. Contrary to what many Eastern teachings would say, you could have a pure consciousness that isn't aware of anything. Husserl says, no, by its nature, consciousness is always consciousness of something. And he hoped by that insight to get over the hurdle that was left by Descartes, where we have an inner world, I think, and then there's an outer world out there. And that's the mind-body dualism that's plagued philosophy since that's happened. We experience it, but how they're radically different sorts of things. The physical world is radically different than our interior world, and our interior world is radically different than that. But obviously, we inhabit both. How could that possibly be? So you wind up saying, well, one's true and the other one must be an illusion in some way. So if you're materialist, sort of our subjective world is something that's given off by the brain. And if you're idealist, no, the whole phenomenal world that we perceive is somehow given structure and form through the categories of the mind. That's Kant or something like that. One of the Heidegger sort of rebelled against Husserl because he believed that Husserl was still in the old school of German idealism in some way. And he wanted to completely get away and start philosophy over in a completely different way. And also, Husserl wanted to turn philosophy into a science. And this is not what Heidegger was interested. But Heidegger was interested in how language is a key focal interface, put it that way, some computer speak, between us and our experience of being. And he talks about language being the house of being. And this is a statue of Heraclitus, who was one of the pre-Socratic philosophers that Heidegger wanted to go to. And in his later writings, the being in time is truncated. He only finished the first part of it. And he said, he's going to work on the second part, but he gave that up. And in his later work, he no longer wrote these huge magnum opus sort of things like Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit or Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. He wrote essays about poetry, art, architecture, technology. He writes a lot about Heraclitus. He writes a lot about Anaximander. He writes a lot about like one line from one of these pre-Socratic philosophers and drawing out through etymological inferences, new meanings in the language. And he also wrote a great deal about the German philosopher Hölderlin, whom he said in his poetry was able to sing being. You can't say being in a syllogism. You can't speak it. You can't prove it in a scientific kind of formulae, but you can say it. You can sing it, he would say. But the other strain that came out of Heidegger, and the one that focused more on language, was what we know as deconstruction. And the guy there with the Johnny Halliday haircut, that's Jacques Derrida, sort of the high priest of deconstructionism. And he based a lot of his ideas on the work of Ferdinand Saussure, who's a Swiss linguist. And Saussure's fundamental idea is that whereas the poets, like Hölderlin, and Kabbalists, the Jewish mystical system, who believe that the words they speak actually have a real intimate connection to the things they're talking about. He says, no, we call an apple, it just turned out that way. If we called it something else and everybody agreed on that, that's what it would be. We call blue, blue, but if we all wanted to call it something else, and we all agreed on that, we could do that. There's no inherent relationship between the phonemes that we use to indicate things and the things we're indicating. It's just an arbitrary set of conventions that we've come to accept. And this undermines the whole idea that when you speak, you're actually saying something about something out in the world. And again, that's the exact opposite of what, say, at the most extreme opposite we could have the Kabbalistic notion that the actual letters of the Jewish alphabet or that which God created the universe. Tangentially, in the beginning was the word in Christianity, all right? So in Hindu, it's Om, which is a sound. It's not a word. We know it stands for something, but it doesn't have a specific meaning. And in Christianity, it's the word. It's logos, which actually has meaning. But for science, it's just a big bang. It's just noise. So I would say there's three different ways in which sound is supposed to be, at the beginning of things. And in our Western scientific, it's the one which is the most denuded of any kind of meaning. It's just a loud noise, which didn't happen anyway because there was no atmosphere in space. So there was no space in the first place. So there wouldn't be any space, wouldn't be any atmosphere, nothing to vibrate, and no ears to hear it, right? And it couldn't be big because there's nothing else to compare it to. So it was the, indefinite dimensioned dud, I would say, rather than the Big Bang. But that's just me. I'm not a scientist. But Saussure is one who says, it's just the sign and signified. And this, Derrida picked up on this in old deconstructionists, and this whole notion that, Heidegger's talking about being, and then in his later writings he calls it presence, Anwesenheit, and he says, well, we don't even have that. We can't even there is no primordial being to get back to. Language is not the house of being, or it's more of a nomad that pitches a tent here and there rather than builds a house and lives in it. It travels around all the time. And what the deconstructionists did, and this is what people in literary criticism departments in universities, they were over the moon about this because it gave them something to do. They started to take apart all the great works. Let's find that one little thread there where it's loose, but in many ways, it was sort of like a red herring because, I mean, the whole idea of the Sprachfrage, the question of language, was already in Vienna in the late 19th, early 20th century. That whole Karl Kraus, Hofmannsthal, and others at the time were all confronted with, there's a wonderful short story called The Lord Chandos Letter by Hofmannsthal, who wrote librettos for Strauss opera. And he's a writer, and it's a letter about how he can no longer use language because the words are no longer, they're slipping off things when he tries to, and that's why it inhibits him. That's why he can't speak anymore. He doesn't want to speak in cliches and empty phrases, and it doesn't mean anything to him anymore. So it wasn't anything new. But what happened is that American universities, they're absolutely overjoyed that anything comes over to them from Europe, and they're completely like, yeah, this is it. And so they went to town, and Deconstructionism, then its close cousin postmodernism, that spread like a wildfire in the States. And here we go. Who let the lit crits out? Roland Barthes, famous one, writing degree 0. And again, the whole notion that the author is the last person who could possibly know what he's writing about. It takes the much more brilliant literary critic, who's no longer just doing criticism. This is creative work. So this is another thing too. We're not these lowly lit crits anymore. We're creative thinkers as well. But our creative thinking is taking apart the so-called classics and showing that these writers didn't know what they meant. This one over here, Jeffrey Hartman, who's probably the most important one in America. Interesting character here, Paul de Man. I don't know if you know about him. He's a Belgian. I was just in Brussels last week, so I was reminded he was a Belgian. I thought that was important. And this whole scandalous material about him. During the occupation of Belgium in the 40s, he was collaborationist. He wrote pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic tracts for journals. He was in some business, I forget exactly what he was, but he was arrested, or at least charged with forgery and fraud. He acquired several university degrees with misinforming the universities about his past academic career, and so on and so on. So the idea that words don't really mean what they mean. Exactly. The idea that, yes, right, well, and actually what actually happened was like Derrida, when all this came out about Paul de Man sometime in the 80s, Derrida took one of these articles he wrote for the pro-Nazi journal in Belgium and deconstructed it to show that actually he meant the exact opposite of what you can do anything, right? I mean, this among other things, this was at the height when I was in university a long time ago, and it was at the beginning of the PC thing, and I was outed as an essentialist. I was outed as a Platonist, meaning that I think there is a human nature. We're not just historically conditioned, absolutely. There is such a thing as, Sartre said, there's no human nature, there's a human condition. But I'm of the old school, and I think there is a human nature to some degree. I can't say exactly what it is, but I don't think, well, I disagree with Locke, the notion that there's nothing in the mind that didn't get there by way of the senses, which means that all of us, when we're born, it's like an empty flat, and we have to go to IKEA and buy a bunch of stuff, bring it home, and then, oh, it's furnished. So I would say no. Jung, we're born with the archetypes. Plato would say we somehow have inherent access to the forms. Kant would say the categories, and so on and so on. But this is politically incorrect because we're all supposed to be blank slates so that we create the perfect utopian society if the appropriate social forces, have their way and can manipulate us. So postmodernity, ho. So the next thing is we go from that language doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean, although do those guys mean what they mean in their books when they write them? That's what I always wondered. So do you know what you really meant when you wrote this book? Because you're saying no one knew what they meant when they wrote their books, but let's not go there. So we have Lyotard, who talks about the postmodern condition. So it's the breakdown of all the meta-narratives, the big stories, whether it's the Christian story or progress, the Hegelian road to freedom, or science, or something like that. All that's broken down. All that has become suspect. That's all the workings of an imperialist kind of consciousness, a universalist consciousness that totalizes, and all that kind of rhetoric that was going on around then. And then you have Baudrillard over here, and the whole idea, this is the Society of the Spectacle. You mentioned the situationists who are about that as well. It's increasingly, we do not have any contact with reality. Not only is there no reality, we're not in touch with it either. We're not in touch with what's not there. All of our experience is mediated through something. And increasingly, what's happening is that which is mediating, that which is simulating, the simulacra, is taken over for the real thing. I mean, what you hear a lot these days is, we live in a simulation. And I always ask, a simulation of what? Because you have to have the original to have a simulation. You can't just start out with a simulation. But no one ever answers that one for me. And so the most ubiquitous agent of our mediation these days is the phone. But one of the increasing, okay, I'll go quickly. This is just quickly again. This is another thing about in the universities where these ideas are taking over. When I was first in university a long time ago, this was a very important book, The Closing American Mind by Alan Bloom. He was at the University of Chicago, the Committee on Social Thought. Saul Bellow was someone else that was on that, Leo Strauss. And his argument was that all the 60s radicals, this is May 68, when almost all of France was brought to a standstill because of the students rebelling. That's the Situationists were involved in that whole thing. And even in that context, they're saying, make your dreams your reality, power to the imagination, fulfill your desires. So it's not particularly political statements. It's a notion of you demand what reality is. No longer accept the reality that's being handed to you. You demand the new reality. And they're motivated in many ways by this Heideggerian, Herbert Marcuse, who was, sort of he was up there with R.D. Laing and others at the time, very, very popular intellectual figure. One-Dimensional Man is probably his most famous book. But he's in that Freudian Marxist Heideggerian melange, where Bloom talks about quite a bit in that book. And one of the things he points out is that the postmodernists come out of, who are generally associated with the left, in Derrida, their sources are two men of the right. Nietzsche certainly wasn't a leftist. He was apolitical, but his politics were, I wouldn't say he was fascist, but he certainly had an aristocratic notion of an elite, the Übermensch or something like that, who'd be too busy actually exploring their own selves to have to lord it over anybody. I don't believe his notion of the Übermensch was some, jackbooted, muscular character. It's like, they'd be too interested in meditating or, trying to understand the notion of time or something like that. And Heidegger, who we know had more than a close encounter with National Socialism. He was a member of the party in the early years. He jumped ship, fairly quickly after, but he had that odious speech when he accepted the directorship, and he's aligning the destiny of being with the rise of National Socialism because they are resolutely gripping the reality that the rest of us, the bourgeois, avoid, and acting in the world and resolutely facing the destiny of being, and so on and so on, all that kind of rhetoric. So, and just quickly. So, what also is building up around this time? Okay, so there's no truth, there's no reality. Words don't mean anything. The simulation is taking over from the real thing. At the same time, you have what's the philosopher Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutics of suspicion, where Darwin, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche have all undermined all of the previous notions of high ideals and stuff like that. We're all animals. We're all want to sleep with our mothers. I doubt that one, actually. It's just economics rules everything. Culture and anything like that is just the what they call it, the superstructure over the economic forces. So we're very suspicious of everything. At the same time, you have the rise of conspiracy consciousness, where almost anything will be believed as long as it doesn't come from the government. So you have David Icke, you have the Greys, have nothing against them. I know people that are into UFOs. That's fine. But it's this notion that as long as the government isn't, as long as none of the hitherto accepted, believed agents of truth are saying something, then we'll accept it. So in one sense, you're absolutely radically suspicious of everything, and then you're open-minded to a fault. So the line of descent to get us to the punchline here. So we start with Nietzsche up in the lonely mountaintop, seeing what's going to come. It's unavoidable. 200 years hence, Heidegger picks this up, starts teaching it in universities to a small group first. He was known as the secret king of philosophy. Hannah Arendt was one of his students. Karl Jaspers, people like that. Derrida picks this up. Look at that haircut. I mean, come on. He picks this up, and it becomes, he deconstructs Heidegger. And then they start deconstructing everything. And then, we get to Baudrillard, and now here we are. We are so, reality is so attenuated that we have to turn on television to get it now. We can't bump into it anywhere outside of the means of its mediation for us now. And so it's there. So what has this got to do with Trump? Well, here we go. As I said, Trump probably never heard of Nietzsche, probably never heard of Deconstructionism, might have heard of postmodernism because he was a builder, so that's an architectural form or something like, give me something postmodern. Yeah, something like that. But the idea that reality is malleable, that you can create your own reality, that we no longer have to accept facts as facts, they're just interpretation, yeah, I'll go for that. I'll run with that. And he got that initially because he was a devotee of Norman Vincent Peale, who was an American religious thinker who put together a kind of Christianized version of what's known as mental science or new thought. Your thoughts create reality. Thoughts are things. Think and grow rich. So some way just through sort of thinking and meditating and focusing on something that you really, really want, as the Spice Girls used to say a long time ago. They're Spice Women now, right, or something? The Spice, oh yes, Spice person, sorry. The Spice people. Watch out. If you focus on that intently enough, long enough, it will come true. This is just a magic. He put it in a Christian sense. And when Trump's father was a devotee, and he used to take the family to see Peale's sermons at the Grace Lutheran Church on 29th Street and 5th Avenue, New York. And then Trump carried on that tradition. And if you want to know how highly he valued Peale, he said, after sitting through one of his sermons, he said, I could sit through that again. And for a man who had the attention span of a gnat, that's some high endorsement, I would say. And who is this strange character here? You remember the alt-right? They were in the news a few years ago. So the reason I got into all this and wrote the book was that, as I mentioned, the alt-right and people associated with Richard Spencer, they claim to have used the internet to have magically helped Trump win the election. And they did this by flooding the internet with images of this cartoon character, Pepe the Frog, who started out as an innocuous kind of slacker character in cartoons. His creator is a fellow named Matt Fury, and I think he subsequently became Matt Furious because his creation had been taken over, hijacked, culturally appropriated by the alt-right. First off, there was a lot of posting, different like rock stars and other celebs were playing around with it. It became a kind of thing, a meme, a meme that was generated. But then the alt-right got a hold of it, and they started showing, Pepe as Trump, Pepe looking over the wall into Mexico. There was a group that, what's her name? The woman who ran against him, I forgot her name. How quickly we forget. Hillary, yeah. She called his group the Deplorables or something like that. And then so there were memes about the Deplorables and Steve Bannon and Trump and all these different things. And the day after Trump won the election, Spencer was the head of what was known as the National Policy Institute, which is a very innocuous title for a far-right group. And they met in the Ronald Reagan building in Washington. And at the beginning of the talk, of their meeting, he said, "Hail Trump! Hail our hero! We made this happen. We made this dream come true." And everyone in the audience doing that. And subsequently, those were apparently Roman salutes. I was subsequently came to understand. But the idea was that they claimed they actually made it happen through what's known as synchromysticism. I can't go into it now. But if you're aware of Jung's idea of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, you know, something going on in your head and something out there, and it's exactly in line and in such a way that it makes you feel like somebody had arranged it, you know, to give you a message. Well, if you, instead of, or in our mind, you put the internet, which I tend to see as a kind of exteriorized imagination, you put the internet, and so what they said, basically, if you do it on the internet, and if you do it on the internet enough, it'll happen in real life. So there's a whole backstory to that, which I can't go into now. But someone who is a sort of new thought mental science blogger picked up on this. Because all the, you know, the saluting, that kind of stuff, that was all on CNN and everything like that. But nobody really picked up on the Pepe the Frog kind of thing. And this fellow who was a new thought blogger wrote about it. And then one of my publishers says, "What do you think about this?" And I said, "Well, maybe there's a book there." So, that it? Yeah, that's it. Oh, no, no, that's a different one. That's a different one. Okay, no. So, I don't know, has that helped you in any way? Could you have spent the past hour in a better way?
I think
Thank you very much.
It's difficult to think of how we could do that.
Thank you very much.
Before I throw it open, I just wanted to ask you a question, to sort of bring it back to politics. Do you think that some of the people who have consciously wanted to trash Western foundational human rationalist epistemology, philosophy, have had a political motivation in wanting to do so? I mean, you mentioned Heidegger, who clearly wanted us to become more primitive, to kind of escape from Aristotelian stuff. You mentioned the French, you know, postmodernists who were all very excited by May '68 and revolution on the streets and throwing Molotov cocktails through bar windows and all that kind of stuff. Is it that there are certain revolutionary strains of politics, regardless of whether they present themselves as fascist or Marxist or anarchist, that really want us to get back to a more sort of primal way of living, a more emotive style of politics, whereas sort of liberal rationalism requires us to try and analyze society objectively. We have to sort of see other human beings not as avatars for groups, but as actual beings who have rights, and that in a way this kind of anti-metaphysical kind of philosophy is really designed to sort of bring about something kind of quite sinister.
Well, I mean, someone I didn't mention here who's active now in Russia is this fellow named Alexander Dugan. You may have heard about him in the context of, you know, Putin, and a while ago sadly his daughter was killed in a assassination attempt. It's probably on him. The car exploded, and it's a few months ago. Well, I mean, I talk about Dugan in the book, and he's had a remarkably strange political trajectory. He started out as a anti-Soviet punk in the 80s, but most recently he's been lecturing on geopolitics to the Kremlin, you know, general staff or something like that. And but he's completely comes out of the Heideggerian. But he's someone who blends something like Heidegger's philosophy with chaos magic, which is the form of magic that the alt-right were supposed to have used in using the internet to, because he spreads memes on the internet as well. And he has, his main idea is that there's been one central war throughout history. Different participants in it at different times, but there's only one battle. And it's a battle, he says, between the Atlanticists, which are the maritime mercantile nations. So US, England, Japan, all the merchants going around on the seas, and what he calls the Eurasianists, which are a traditional culture, and they inhabit the mother of all continents, the largest landmass on the planet. And he envisions what he sees as this new Eurasian civilization rising up from Vladivostok to Dublin, he basically says. So how much Putin, how much, but he believes that the Western individual is the demon of demons. And he didn't coin this, I coined this, is that the West has a me economy. See, the economy is all about me. What do I want? What can I get? I want it now, and don't, you can't say I can't have it, and blah, 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 that kind of thing. And he says, whether this is rhetoric or true, he says in Russia there's the we. It's the we economy, so it's all brotherhood and communal. It's not the individual, it's the community and all that. But he does envision some final smackdown between these two sides. And out of that, the cataclysm will be a reversion to a more primal, primitive, non-tech. That's the other thing too. I mean, and rightly so. I mean, there's problems with technology. There's been problems with progress and all of that. So I don't think you can hold it against Heidegger and others. I mean, William Blake was arguing against progress, before, Heidegger, 200 years ago and all that. But he does envision some kind of this whole non-technological. This is the manipulation of technology, is the manipulation of being through the will to power for Heidegger. So, and we know he was very much, blood and soil, very much a regional character, wasn't cosmopolitan, didn't like cities and all that sort of stuff. So very much of the earthy. So there is, and some degree, again, I don't know how much, and I know he's written about ecology, or he's taken up as a thinker in ecological circles, but I mean, a great deal of kind of ecological thinking would have something like that happen. Humans are a blight on the planet, and that's why I wrote the book Caretakers of the Cosmos, arguing to the contrary. But yes, so, But
that seems a theme that very much, say, today would link the sort of more extreme elements of an Extinction Rebellion or the Green Party with certain kind of fascistic traditions of thought. And all of this does seem to require an abandonment of.
Well, I mean, I guess the idea is that it's bankrupt. Liberal democracy is bankrupt. It's led to the globalization of the planet and turning the whole planet into a marketplace. And this is what people like Dugan and others are up in arms about. So I mean. It's difficult today, I would say, to argue for the individual as having any kind of agent, because all of the rhetoric is against that. Yeah. You're an example of a group, and these ubiquitous anonymous social forces, whether it's language, whether it's economics, or anything else, that is somehow, even though we think we're making our own decisions, we're actually not. We're trapped, and I mean, but this is something ages ago when I was doing my philosophy degree, and I was reading the Frankfurt School and Derrida. And I could understand the Frankfurt School more than I could understand Derrida. At least they were readable. But it was a very dire view of things. I mean, Adorno's negative dialectics. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's one of the most sterile works of philosophy ever, because he said Hegel said the whole is the true. Adorno turned that on his head and said, no, the whole is the false. So we are entrapped in this encompassing system, and we can't do anything about it. There's nothing we can do. All of our actions are already predetermined, or our choices are illusory, and that sort of thing. And I just had an instinctual sense of this can't be the case, because I guess I have a healthy confidence in my own ability to make decisions. Perhaps that's illusory, but I'd rather go with that illusion than not. It's sort of like Pascal's wager. We were talking about this earlier. So if you believe your actions are meaningful, and they turn out not to be, well, too bad, right? If you believe your actions aren't meaningful and they turn out to be not meaningful, then it doesn't matter. But if you believe your actions are not meaningful and they turn out to actually be meaningful, then you made a mistake. So the sure bet is to act as if they are meaningful, because that's the only way you can win in it. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I tend to work under that assumption myself. So I wouldn't bother to write books if I didn't think,
Yeah, I mean, that's the great contradiction of these people who say we're all determined.
Well, they say language communicates nothing, and let me go into great detail about that.
Does anybody else want to come in?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting. And I did read the paper before, so I had the outline of it. But you say right at the end, that obviously Nietzsche talks about untimely men. And if we consider ourselves as untimely men and women here, because maybe we see what's happening. But you say that there's been quite a lot, or you've written a lot about that, and there's a cause for optimism. And I wonder if you might just say something, I mean, you mentioned a little bit in the answers asked, but I wondered if you might say, people who are working in this field, there are philosophers that you identify at the moment who are actually now challenging this and moving everything forward.
Well, I mean, there are. It's a different context. I mean, someone I think who's done important work in recent years, and I've written about in my books, is Ian McGilchrist. He did this book about 10 years ago called The Master and His Emissary, and it's in neuroscience, but he rebooted the left and right brain kind of story, and he's written a follow-up to that, something called The Matter with Things, which is one of these books that you have with you on the deserted island. I think that'll keep you occupied for a while. But he puts a lot of this in the context of the differences between how the two hemispheres of the brain, not so much what they do, but how they do it. And so he would say the crises that we find ourselves in today have to do with, or rooted in many ways, in the dominance of the left brain, which tends to look at everything sequentially, logically, utilitarianly, practically. It's if you remember when I said the Bergson, how the brain is the organ for attention to life. Well, that in the sense of being able to maneuver through the world and manipulate it to our advantage. That would be the left brain sort of thing. It's very precise. It's able to focus in on individual phenomena with a laser-like, accuracy at the expense of the connection to other things. The right brain, which McGilchrist says is actually earlier, it created the left brain, so it's the master, left brain is the emissary, but the emissary has taken over, it's usurped power. It has a fuzzy, global, kind of total, this isness, this Istigkeit. When we have that sense of being, of just being, a kind of inner feeling of it, he would say this is the right brain doing what it does. But all sense of meaning, all sense of connection to things, to the outer world and nature and all that, comes through that kind of global perception of things that the right brain has. But McGilchrist says over the last couple of centuries, certainly since the rise of the Industrial Revolution and technology, the left brain likes nothing better than to recreate the world as something that it's familiar with, because it's much easier to deal with things then. So it's manically busy recreating the world around it to be exactly like everything else that it knows. So you might say, politically that's globalization in one sense. You travel around the world, there's the same shops everywhere you go. Yeah, exactly like that. Whereas, and the problem with that is that there's less and less of a left brain mediated initial world for the right brain just to present. So when you're surprised by a leaf, even though you've seen thousands of them throughout your lifetime, it's suddenly, wow, I've never seen it like that before. That's the right brain, just here's reality, just giving it to you before your left brain kicks in to say, well, what should I do? Should I rake the garden? all that kind of stuff. So any forms of meditation, Zen Buddhism, poetry, the arts, or at least they used to do this instead of innervating us these days, are ways in which we can relax into this non-functional, non-utilitarian mode, but they're increasingly less and less and less. So he sees hope because he says historically there seem to be periods when the two work together. they're supposed to work as the U.S. government is in this system of checks and balances. You know, the Congress and the House of Representatives, so they mitigate for the other's excesses. But what's happened is increasingly, let me say, the right brain's, okay, yeah. The left brain, which is connected to the right hand, is increasingly out of control. And so I would say he offers almost a science, although there's a lot of criticism of his work, and a lot of neuroscientists say this is just hooey. But I think he offers anchors a lot that we would otherwise only understand, like philosophically or through literature in kind of, our brain function. So I think there's hope for that there. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the often discredited New Age or spiritual world that I myself am in to some degree, because I write books about Rudolf Steiner and Jung and Swedenborg and Madame Blavatsky and all this kind of stuff and the history of that. So I've done a big. I don't want to say I'm the person to come to. I'm the go-to person, but I did do a big book called The Secret Teachers of the Western World, which is about the history of the lost counter tradition of the esoteric or hermetic tradition, which lost its street cred around the early 17th century when the rise of what we now know as science began to be dominant and all that. So there is a history there, but if McGilchrist is right and the left brain is calling the shots, it's only going to paint that as something that, that's just rubbish. That's just, we don't want that. Oh, no, don't go there. Everyone will think you're silly if you're reading this kind of stuff. So I think it's there, but you have to find it.
So is there a kind of third? Sorry, did you want to come back? No, you did.
No, absolutely.
I interrupted you.
I'm just really glad that there are people turning the television off.
Yeah. So is there a kind of third way, in a way, between, on the one hand, sort of logical positivism, so-called, it says, everything is meaningless unless you can weigh it or calculate it or something, and that talk of other stuff is utterly pointless. So that's one end of the continuum. The other end of the continuum, it seems to me, is the sort of what I would consider to be, the flight into the road to sort of insanity of postmodernism. That reality is purely constructed by ideologies, and then it becomes a question of which ideology wins, and so you have this kind of will to power between them. But it seems to me there's a sort of third way which says we can both have a rationalist understanding of the world. We can capture reality through our cognitive powers and to some extent through how we talk, our language. But that's not the whole story. And that the whole sort of quest for meaning and spirituality is something the human mind can also engage in, but it's not necessarily. It may be only true for us as individuals in terms of how we achieve meaning. It's not that reality out there is sort of malleable in the same way you've been talking about the conspiracy theorists and the sort of left postmodernist types who are saying it's all malleable. It's just a question of who gets to do the manipulation. Yeah.
Well, I mean, as I just said, I think we already have this third way throughout, our culture and all that, but it's been sort of demoted to, well, that's poetry or that's art. It's not the serious stuff. I mean, nowadays, when we want to know the secrets of the universe, we don't go to a poet. It's like, an astronomer who blathers on about the mysteries of black holes. Or David Icke or something like that. So I can't help but see it in some historical way in which, and again, it's nothing new. I mean, when Jesus said, or the apostles said, he said this, man does not live by bread alone, or I'm assuming he meant women as well, that's what that's about. Not to say the Christian way is the way, but the notion that there are other things in life other than just, what we need, materially need. We need those things, obviously we need them. But you just subsist then, you're not living, and life, they talk, the water, if you drink of this water, if you drink of that water, you will be thirsty a half hour from now. If you drink of this water, you will never thirst. So it's that so we have that tradition, and it's in a variety of different ways, but it's not honored. It's just, to use a word I don't like myself, but it's seen as somehow, that's nice, it's nice to have that kind of thing, but in reality, this is, But I can only feel that these contradictions will have to be faced at some point, because again, you have all these shows about the mysteries of science. I'm nothing against them, nothing against mystery of science, the mysteries of black holes. But the most mysterious thing in the universe is us. Forget the black holes. We can explain them in terms of physics, but we can't explain us in terms of anything. We, as far as I'm concerned, we make the universe mysterious. And we somehow don't, in some ways, we're afraid of that, because we want to be able to explain ourselves in terms of these scientific, logical ways. It's either a biological determinism or a social determinism or psychological determinism. There's some way in which, oh, you're like that because of this. Rather than like, yeah, all these factors impinge on you, but they impinge on a something that's there in the first place that actually has free will and agency and can act in the world and is creative and actually brings something new into the world. So I think it's there, but it's you have to get over the notion that the truth equates with practical utility. I think that's, that's what our notion of truth is like, oh, does it work? Can it make anything happen? It's nice to listen to Beethoven, but does it do anything? I mean, Auden said poetry doesn't do anything. But it does something, but it's not the usual things. Well, it's not practical. It's not that you can measure. You can't measure it, But I mean, that's the $64,000 question, as they used to say. How do we create a society or a life in which those sorts of things that are not immediately practically useful have some kind of honor? Religion used to do that, but we don't like religion anymore. That's why there's many religions now. It's all individuals seeking their own kind of spiritual, development and truth, which can lead down strange roads, like Norman Vincent Peale or David Icke. Could also lead down to deeply meaningful things.
Is there anybody else who'd like to make a point?
No.
Let's take them both together and then you can answer them.
Yes. Do you think there's any truth in that claim that the alt-right online subculture, that they played a role in the rise of Trumpism, or is it just a coincidence that you had these online trolls whose guy coincidentally won, and that they then told themselves, oh look, we made this happen?
Well, I have to say, I said something earlier, I don't see any compelling reason to categorically deny that it's possible. Did it actually happen? I don't know. But given that I've written a book about Jung, and I've had many experiences of synchronicities myself, and I've written about them, where I can't explain how this particular thing happened. It's deeply meaningful experience to me. So given that I believe we live in a world where such things happen. The world is such that these things happen. So that leads me to think, well, I don't know if they actually made Trump win through posting Pepe the Frog memes, but how else could he possibly have won? No, I mean, so.
Then he lost.
Then he lost.
And his supporters
he didn't stay, with the storyline according to them. So, yes, it's possible. Does it happen every day? No, I would say. And I hope they don't try it again with anybody. So.
Sally.
It's a bit of an unfair question linked to yours. If you were standing on your lonely mountain now, and you had to, I assume you don't agree with Dugan, I mean, maybe you think that. What do you think is going to happen next? What's your best guess? If this is where we are now, where do you think we're going to be? Not too much.
Yeah. Well, something I posted on my website recently was an article based on a talk I gave a year or two ago during COVID, Zoom talk. And it's an article I have. It's called Transhuman, Superhuman, or Fully Human? Whose future is it? And I make a distinction between, the transhumanist movement or the post-human movement. I mean, we're post everything now, right? I mean, it's going to be post soon. And, the idea that, humanity is just, we're supposed to be extinct anyway, we're on our way out, and so those who are bold and intrepid enough can download their consciousness into a computer and get bionic arms and all that kind of stuff. And then, so that's one notion. And then I brought in the idea, because when I was a kid, I was a great reader of comic books. And I argue that, some of these superheroes, they have the superpowers and all that, but they sort of were role models for me for what the psychologist Abraham Maslow, who's informed my work a great deal, he talked about self-actualization. And you're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where there's food, we need food and air and all that, then, shelter, and then some kind of, connection, some, love connection, and then self-esteem. And most of us stay at that level. We're happy to have all those things, but then there's some who have an incessant urge to go beyond into what he calls self-actualizing. And it's developing a creative level. So it's a need, it's not a deficiency need, it's not a need that you lack something and you need to fulfill it, it's a need you have to give. It's a need you have to use your powers, So Superman has to use his powers and all this sort of thing. And so I say, well, what is the future going to be? Is it going to be a transhuman sort of future for us in which we lose being human, become something like the cyborg, in Star Trek? Or will it be a generation or people that are fully human in Maslow's? And that's a sort of dicey term to use, fully human, because it somehow suggests that there are some people that are less human. But what he meant by that, he meant like actualizing all of your potential, sounds like be all you can be or something like that. But it's sort of, making actual your potential, what you can have. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a brilliant genius to do something, but anything you do creatively, anything that is a satisfying activity in itself, and you do it just to do it well and all that. And you're not driven by the lack of something. So it's a creative kind of need. So this would be fully human. And my argument is that the transhumanists, they're not really transhuman at all. And one chapter heading is Transhuman, All Too Transhuman, which is a takeoff on one of Nietzsche's books, Human, All Too Human. And because it strikes me that what the transhumanists want to do is just extend human capacity that already exists. So, you can run faster than you could run before, you could fly, just like Superman or something like that. But you're still psychologically, let's say, spiritually, let's say, still at the all too human level, because your aims and motives and desires haven't been transcended at all. You still, you still want the things that you wanted at the deficiency level. Whereas Maslow's fully human is someone who's transcended that, and you're not driven by, getting and spending. You're not driven by fulfilling deficiency needs. And you don't have superpowers, but you awaken creative abilities within yourself. And I mean, I hope the word transhuman came from Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, who was a biologist. And he wrote about this in the 1960s. And he's said, like, we've woken up to the fact that we're in control of our own evolution now as a species. And that's what he saw as transhuman, was the sense that we're no longer being driven by something pushing us. We can choose what direction to go into. And for him, this was exploring the arts, exploring spirituality, exploring a variety of different creative potentials. Not technology, not high tech, not the kind of cyborg world that the transhumanists seem to be. So I think the next thing is going to be an argument about what does it mean to be human anymore. And I think the transgender thing and all that plays into that as well. In the article, I mentioned that a couple years ago before COVID, I was at a conference in the Esalen Institute, which is in Northern California along the beautiful Big Sur coastline. And it was a conference on the perennial philosophy, but it turned out to be actually all the academics who were there who taught religious studies in American universities were dead against the perennial philosophy, dead against any kind of... Perennial philosophy means there's one sort of primal source for all of the religions, some fundamental kind of, insight or vision of human and our place in the cosmos and so on. All the other religions somehow, tributaries out of that. This is a bad idea because it's universalist and it's colonial and it's imperial and you're trying to force one size fits all on. And he said, one very young, eager academic said, I have a real problem with the term human. And I said, well, you're not alone. There's quite a few others, before you. But it just struck me as like, I don't know. I'm of an old school, generation where we're all one fundamentally at basic. So the whole kind of identity politics and all that sort of stuff just strikes me as fragmenting, increasingly fragmenting things. But I don't see where there's a quick way out. And actually, maybe this is a different sort of thing, a different talk that I added on to. And this is Arnold Toynbee, who died in the early 70s. And he wrote, again, another book to take on the deserted island is just a study of history, because it's like that, you know. But he says, of the 22 civilizations that have appeared in history, 19 of them collapsed when they reached the moral state the United States is in now. And he says, civilizations come to birth and proceed to grow by successfully responding to successive challenges. They break down and go to pieces if and when a challenge confronts them, they fail to meet. And Goldilocks is there because what he says is that if a challenge is too great, the civilization can't meet it and it just smashes. If it's not great enough, it overcomes it too easily, gets overconfident, and it goes into a slow, decadent decline. But if it's just right, right? If the porridge is not too hot, not too cold, and just right, the civilization meets the challenge, and it has the requisite energy and creative will to carry on to that. I don't know. He left in the early 70s, so I don't know. I don't know where he would say we're at now. But also the Goldilocks thing applies with the brains as well, because you don't want just left and just right, but just right, right? Not only left or only right, but just right, when the two work together. In creative moments, moments of insight, Maslow's peak experiences, we all have these moments all the time. You know, we just grown up in a way we haven't been taught how to recognize them, or oh, that's just in your head, kind of thing. So I don't know. It's up to you.
And that's a great and very liberal line, very much in keeping with the IAA's thinking, to end on. It's been a fantastic privilege to hear you
pleasure.
speak, an incredible tour de force. I feel I kind of know the whole history of Western civilization and thought, and I'll be trying to communicate that in a postmodern way to other people, even though obviously I don't. But Gary, thank you so much.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.